The recognition that the world has one single global tourism system, it's mass tourism, and it is absolutely imperative that we make it sustainable. It's really looking at conceptually and more increasingly empirically how we can have mass tourism that's also sustainable tourism. Because if we don't deal with mass tourism, then sustainability is meaningless, because alternative tourism is really just such a very small part of world tourism that even if it were sustainable, which is a contentious issue, it doesn't really matter if that's sustainable. So we have to deal with the situation in countries like China, where you have hundreds of millions of tourists. And I've really been working with this notion of enlightened mass tourism, where you synthesize the best aspects of mass tourism, which is economies of scale, for example, and competitiveness, and you mix that with the best characteristics of alternative tourism, which would be things like ethics and very strong sense of place and community involvement in tourism. As a full-time academic in the 1980s, I was a very big supporter of alternative tourism. And my belief, which was quite radical at the time, was that any kind of mass tourism was bad. And then I gradually began to realize that alternative tourism had a lot of negative aspects to it as well, potentially. And so more recently I came up with this idea that you could have sustainable mass tourism or unsustainable alternative tourism, which were kind of the opposite of what most people were assuming. And then from there I began to realize that really all tourism is part of one system anyways. So there's really no such thing as alternative tourism. Large scale or small scale is really part of one gigantic tourism system. By definition, it's mass tourism, and we have to face that in the eye and understand how we can make it sustainable. Say bad alternative tourism is volunteer tourism. So in theory it was very good, the idea that people from European countries would go to poor countries and actually get their hands dirty and volunteer with environmental or social initiatives. And then a number of authors began to point out the extent to which these kinds of activities are driven more by ego than altruism. And for a lot of people it was a question of, okay, now I've done that, and now I have a really good chance of getting the job I want. And there really wasn't much personal investment in actually helping the destination. I hesitate to use this term, but I will anyways, enlightened capitalism. And what I mean by that is businesses exist to make money for their shareholders. We can't really escape that conclusion. They're not social institutions, so we have to appeal to the, as it were, the profit-making aspects of being green and being socially responsible. So more and more I think the hotels really realize that if they retrofit their lighting with LED bulbs, if they go solar, that this can actually be a money-making thing, and then it has the great benefit of also being environmentally and socially sustainable. The other issue is that the tourism is only going to get bigger. I mean, we talk about things like climate change, we talk about all sorts of factors that might reduce the flow of tourism, but while it may reduce the flow of tourism in one particular area, people will just go somewhere else. People have the money, and it's an innate human desire to travel, and more countries are getting on board. China, again, being the classic example. So we have to face this phenomenon of what I call tourization, and it's global tourization now, where even very large countries are becoming more or less dependent directly and indirectly on tourism. And more of the world's landscape, tourism is really the dominant economic sector.